Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's IM public lecture, the last one of this academic year. My name is Vivian Howard, and I'm the Acting Director of the School of Information Management at Dalhousie University. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. We also acknowledge the many contributions of the African Nova Scotian community, which has lived on this land for generations. Before we get started, I'd just like to review a few quick housekeeping details. If you have questions, and I encourage you to add your questions to the chat as we go through, but please just type your questions in the chat on the right-hand side, and you can do that anytime during the presentation. When questions appear in the feed, you can upvote them with the thumbs up. The more thumbs up, the higher priority a question is given, and that helps ensure that that particular question will be asked. And if you would like closed captioning, please click on the CC. So it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Ashley Casovan. Ashley is an engaged and innovative leader who has always had a deep interest in advancing the public good. Recently leaving her long-standing career in the public service, where she was last Director of Data and Digital for the Government of Canada, she has now taken on the role of Executive Director of Responsible AI Institute, a non-profit dedicated to creating practical tools to ensure the responsible use of AI. Throughout her career, she has worked at the intersection of innovative technology and data and its impact on providing better information and services. This evening, Ashley will be speaking about adopting responsible AI in practice. This session will discuss the important role of responsible AI framework and tools to drive end-to-end data and model transparency and trust. Topics will include real-life examples and challenges from early adopters on driving responsible AI implementation to improve AI governance and control and accelerate adoption of enterprise AI. Please join me in welcoming Ashley Casovan. Over to you, Ashley.
Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here. It's wonderful to be able to share this presentation and this discussion with all of you tonight. So as mentioned by Vivian, that's the focus that I'm really interested in is the impact that AI has on society, but also really thinking about how that gets implemented, how these concepts and both promises and then some of the perils will be integrated into how we can actually design, develop, and then deploy these systems. And so something that we think about quite a bit is both those opportunities, but then also how do we ensure that there's trust and that can be scaled appropriately. And so just through the course of the discussion tonight, we'll share a little bit of background in terms of how I got engaged and involved in this topic, and then the experience that I had in the Government of Canada to really try and put those principles into practice, how we're learning from that experience and the work that we're doing at the Responsible AI Institute, and how all of that's leading to the development of a certification mark for the responsible use of AI systems. And I've heard that these are typically very good discussions, and so we'll definitely make sure to leave a lot of time for the question and answer period at the end. So given that this is really a topic of conversation coming out of information management, I think that it is important to know that that's really my background and where I'm coming from in approaching this discussion and approaching the work that I do broadly. And I think, though, it is important, and I will get into that quite a bit, But I do think that it's just important to take a quick step back and recognize how AI is becoming embedded into every aspect of what we do, often whether we know it or not, whether or not it's called AI or whether or not it is very clear or transparent to us that that's the case. And so there's been many estimates by many organizations that there's then going to be this very big impact of the use of AI technologies. And I will speak over the course of this today to identify what we're talking, or what we mean when we're talking about AI systems. And this just gives you a little bit of a map of where AI is being built. But I think it's also important to think about where AI is being used. And so one thing that's become really of interest to me is how AI systems, I just want to make sure everyone can see my screen. Oh, okay, it's fine. I just wanted to look in the chat. So I clicked off all my other things that are dinging, so I wanted to make sure. So with that, something that's been of interest to me, really moving away from just these big high-level estimates of the impact of AI systems, and to that comment that I made earlier about it's really becoming part of everything that we do. Something that really struck me, or what really made me understand that, or came to life for me, was when looking at these two different examples. So there was a Future of Mining with AI report that Deloitte did earlier this year, and just probably because it's not an industry I know too much about, but really thinking about the opportunities as it relates to improving safety and using monitors to understand where mineral deposits are, so that it's not disrupting the earth as much as we had done through other types of excavation activities. And so there's really a lot of positives that come from that. Similarly, there's a company out of Montreal called Brainbox AI, and they're really revolutionizing the heating and cooling system, which again, I do not know that much about, but doing so in a way that's really trying to help us make sure that something that's very important to us, heating and cooling, is being done in the most efficient and effective way possible. And when you think about it in that way, you're like, oh, obviously AI systems do make a lot of sense related to that, as they can be used to have appropriate sensors and monitors on when things are supposed to be hot, when things are supposed to be cold, but also just in relation to how the building's being used. So if people are in a particular room, or whether or not the room, maybe due to COVID, is not really being in use as much, that the system in which it was normally set for would be more adaptive. And so these are things where, again, they were just really examples to me, or kind of that struck a chord with me in terms of recognizing the vast, or most expansive application of these systems. And again, not in a way that I always, when I think of AI, thinking about it in terms of augmenting human activity, whether that's through prediction systems or whether that's through robotics. Really, it kind of gets to a lot of stuff that's happening in an invisible way. And similarly, that's how the Government of Canada, when I was Director of Data and Digital, was really thinking about experimenting with the use of AI systems. And that was, there's lots of activities underway at that time, really thinking about, I'm sure all of you have heard this in relation to your information management studies, is really modernizing or digitizing government, or any industry for that matter. And a lot of that related to some of these examples that I'll provide. In the case of benefits, there's lots of efforts, given that a core piece of business that any government does is provides benefits to people in need, and making sure that they get the right benefits and in an effective manner. We saw again with COVID the need to do that at a rapid speed. And so leveraging systems and technologies that can do that effectively and accurately is a necessary function now. And so similarly, wanting to ensure safety of the public, and we don't often think about this, but the Government of Canada operates in over 200 different lines of business. And so going from something like benefits modernization to thinking about the impact of train derailments are things that at a Prime Minister level, all of those things are kind of under that portfolio. And so recognizing how and where these different technologies are going to be used is increasingly needing to be understood, and how to do that also in a holistic way. Well, maybe we're not using the same sensors and monitors that Canadian Pacific Rail uses in chatbots that the CRA uses. There are lots of opportunities where those same underlying technologies can be used through these different lines of business. And that was something that was really of interest to us. I was part of the Treasury Board Secretariat that sets management policy for the government. So we had the opportunity to work with all of these different lines of business to understand what their pain points were and why they were really interested in leveraging these tools. And something that, just to speak to these two at the bottom examples, something that we saw as a big pain point was being able to access information on the website. It was the same time that Canada.ca was really evolving and thinking about how to go from thousands of different Canada.ca, or sorry, different types of websites that the Government of Canada has, to a single Canada.ca presence, and being able to navigate via services. But even that becomes really difficult, and when going through times like tax season, where it's quite it can be very stressful and a strenuous time, you want to be able to get that information when and how you need it. And so there was lots of experiments going on at the time in relation to how to use things like chatbots to really improve that process and get access to information in a lot smoother way. Similarly, using it with all research initiatives, or not all, but some of these research initiatives, to really understand what underlying root causes are and be able to process large amounts of data a lot quicker. But what we found was that the acceptance or adoption of these systems was something that was very concerning for the public, and really this whole entire survey from 2018 is quite interesting, especially to compare it to similar types of surveys today. This exact one hasn't been reproduced, but there are some comparatives, and it really hasn't changed too much. Even though there's been an increased use and adoption of AI systems, these same concerns exist today. And why I particularly liked this one a finding from this survey, there was lots of findings within it related to demographic breakdowns, related to different types of industry verticals. But this one of the more that the AI system could potentially benefit, or the more that it mattered, the lower support there was, really indicating that there was this inherent lack of trust and not understanding that if something's a safety critical type of mechanism, getting access to healthcare, getting access to benefits, then there needed to be a lot more explanation or understanding of how and why that AI system was being used. And so that knowledge really drove a lot of the understanding that we had to build out this work. And coming from a data background or information management background, it was really important for me to understand how that could be the case. And a lot of this was really related to narratives that we saw in the news and the stories that were highlighted there, really where AI systems did go wrong, or AI systems were taking over jobs. But we also saw where AI systems were potentially being used in a way that's experimental, like the use of biometrics in facial recognition or in predictive policing, where there was lots of just either bad data or not the most accurate data being used for the particular purpose of that application. And so this is something that then really drove how we then are thinking about this, both how I did in the Canadian context, but how we're doing it within the Responsible AI Institute now, which is really building off of a lot of those lessons learned from the Government of Canada. And so in this, I think that we tried to really put together an incident database, and we have a map up on our website where you can see where AI has both gone wrong and where it's been both harmful and helpful is how we've decided to categorize it. And so one of the things that we wanted to do, though, is even though I had this experience with the government, and even though there's all of these different lines of business, I really wanted to understand where AI was being used in society writ large, in other countries, and outside of a public sector, what those particular issues were. And so when I first started in 2019, I don't know, a while ago now, 2.5 years ago, with the Responsible AI Institute, at that time called AI Global, in case you were following us then, that these were kind of the narratives that I always saw around what the issues were, is that there could be incorrect identification, misdiagnosis of a health issue, or lack of fairness in a prediction, which could be related to a jail sentence, insurance rate, access to financial credit, etc. And that really led to some systemic challenges, and especially certain demographics being hurt repeatedly. Also then, similar to what I was showing on the previous slide, that sometimes these AI systems are just not actually identifying accurately. And so it's not based on how it's being trained or how it's being designed. People, particularly of demographics where there's a low sample of the appropriate data, then the systems are just not accurate. And then there's a lot, I'm sure, that all of you have been very focused on then issues related to privacy and transparency, but really thinking about how information that's being collected can and should be used, and how often these systems are leveraging data that's being collected without our permission, or with a very difficult understanding of how that permission is being, or it's a very complex process. And so we've sort of just agreed to that. And so with all of these things in mind, it was really important for me to then think about what type of organization should be trying to really take on what we were doing in the Government of Canada, and think about how we do that in a way that is really transcending just the public sector, because a lot of these examples are coming from the private sector as well. And I'll share a little bit more also in a moment about what we did in terms of public policy within the government and how that's related to the certification work that we're doing now. But I think it's important to just contextualize why it's even needed. And I've reviewed a lot of this in the previous slides, but I think just two additional use cases that really will illuminate why this is important, and these are more recent ones, is examples, or one example is of what just happened with Zillow. I'm not sure if anybody follows the housing market news in the US, but one day one of my colleagues had sent me somebody's tweet that said that they had the week before sold their house for 25% above market rate, and then they bought it back their exact same house at 35% under the market rate. And this was a pattern that was occurring, and which eventually led in the following days to Zillow identifying that the AI system that they were using was no longer working as expected, which it hadn't been for quite some time. And they finally decided to shut this entire unit down and the entire system down. And it impacted their workforce, which is incredibly unfortunate. A lot of people are saying that it's positive that it didn't impact people that were actually in the market. But I do think that either way, harms occurred because there wasn't appropriate oversight based on a lot of the lack of any sort of clear regulations in place, there being common oversight mechanisms that are required, any sort of standards for this work. And similarly, I've been following this story for a while, but Robinhood, early on in the pandemic, there were a lot of complaints that were filed against this website or app that allows people to individually trade stocks. And I don't know if it's just because I don't have much time or I'm not that smart, but anyway, I didn't think that this was something that I would be capable of doing when I had the ability to be able to trade, well, have the money to be able to make trades. And so I learned that it's quite a process where there's a lot of signatures required for me to get somebody else to trade my money, a broker. And what was interesting about this is that they had to go through a certification process, and yes, you give them a certain percentage, but then you have some acknowledgement that they're going to do something based on the knowledge that they have. And I do think that that is not accessible for everyone. And so the idea that Robinhood really democratized trading is, I think, really an incredible objective. Where it went wrong, in my opinion, and quite a few others, was when they started to gamify. And so when you were doing trades, they were having confetti and it's like a little party. And so it incentivizes or nudges people to continue down doing the same type of activity. And this really led to people that didn't have that knowledge that my broker has to make investments or make trades that really jeopardize their financial position. And unfortunately, it was a lot of younger people that really did not have the knowledge. And it also allowed them to do very sketchy trades that do require quite a bit of knowledge. And so it's things like this, again, that without any sort of common understanding of standards or oversight mechanisms or having these appropriate regulations in place, then we lead to some of these challenges. And so we're not trying to focus just on, that's why I really wanted to take a step back and identify there's lots of really positive benefits, and yes, it's going to have such a big impact on the economy, but there's really some strong implications for what that is. We do have an opportunity, however, to design these systems in a way that is quite useful and quite interesting for society. And so there's been a lot of work that's been done by international organizations, by governments, by research institutes, by nonprofit organizations like mine, to really think through what those implications are, and through some of those examples that I showed previously, figure out what can be done about that. And so as a result, a lot of work has been done by organizations to identify principles. It was a very big activity between 2018 and even into 2021. And then really, though, at early 2021, a lot of organizations, I think, converged around the OECD principles, and they've become these globally adopted or globally recognized principles for AI systems. There's a lot of incredible work that is being done out of the OECD AI Policy Observatory. And so what's been really important for us is in thinking about what I did within the Government of Canada context, was really try to think about how do we take these principles and create an implementation framework or a set of requirements around these different types of allowing these systems to operate, what types of requirements do we need to put around them? So things like peer review, ensuring that similar to an academic process, there's appropriate people with the appropriate backgrounds and context looking at that process. Ideally, engaging people that could be impacted by those systems is quite important. Providing notification. So I talked about lack of consent or transparency in the use of these systems. So just allowing somebody to know when they're interacting with an AI system or being trained appropriately, which I'll come to in a moment. Human in the loop is a very big context if you've read any of the literature in this space. And that's just really understanding what's that relationship between the human and the machine. So when is there something that a machine's doing, and then really making sure that if it's not continuing to operate as expected, a human is involved in that process so that they can make an appropriate intervention. Similarly, having an understanding of how that system operates and being able to explain it. And then something that will be familiar to anybody that's been involved in the development of technology systems previously is just the need for testing and monitoring, training, and contingency planning of these systems is a pretty common notion. And then finally, approval to operate the system was something that was quite important for us, and it remains important in the work that we're doing now, because it's really getting people to understand that, similar to the examples I was using previously around the need for the appropriate type of data, that you need to have people with different types of knowledge available when approving the system, because they are coming at it from a different perspective and will provide different type of input. And so really what we advocate for quite a bit, both in the Government of Canada context and then the work that we're doing now, is to make sure that you have people with this business knowledge and really understanding what they're trying to achieve with this product or service or system. And then also the people that are developing that to be engaged in a dialogue, as opposed to just a requirements gathering process that is delivered to a development team. And I think it's quite important for those involved in the data collection process and information management to be at the heart of that as well. And so this really leads to then the certification work that we're doing, because it complements all of the things that I've spoken about previously in really trying to get to then specifics on what does it mean to go from these high-level principles of ensuring protection for people and the planet to then a very understood, easy way to do that for the practitioners that are really, as I was saying just previously, coming from these different backgrounds and perspectives. And so something that's been quite useful previously is certification programs to try and draw upon different standards. And I really like to use the analogy of LEED for government, or sorry, not for government, for the design of buildings to ensure that they're done in an environmentally safe way. And that is a program that really draws upon standards like what's the appropriate luminosity of the light bulb, or how thick should your panes of windows be to shield you from the weather. And so these are the different types of things that the U.S. Green Building Council that develops that certification is not building all of them. They're working with the different standards organizations to do so, but they bring them together in a comprehensive way that makes it very clear and easy for people that are designing and developing buildings to know what to do if they want to ensure that the environmental security and safety of these buildings. And so similar to that analogy, what we've done is really thought about what that implementation framework looks like. And so a lot of the things that I reviewed with the approach that we took with the Government of Canada and the requirements there, you'll see are really similar concepts here. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think one of the things that is very important to note is when we're talking about the certification of AI systems, something that was really important to us was to define what an AI system even means. And so really thinking about that in terms of the data, the models, and the context in which it's being situated in. So even the chatbot example that I used earlier, it being trained based on and with data from people in Alberta might be a very different context than people in Halifax. And so just in terms of the nomenclature, in terms of how, in terms of the context that would make sense to them. And we see this, yes, differences within a vast country like Canada, but also, as you can imagine, different value-based contexts from regions all across the world. Yet our solutions that are being built are typically not being developed, as you saw from that map on the very first slide, from people all over the world. There's many areas where they're developing these in a greater capacity. And so applying the same sort of structure, though, to the oversight of those systems is what becomes really important. And so in that, what we've done is really tried to focus on a few key areas. So we've focused on fair lending, fraud detection, automated diagnosis and treatment of systems, health recommendation systems, and automated human resources. And so what we've done is, based on those OECD principles, based on this implementation framework, really trying to work with community experts and then use cases provided by those experts to provide input into that that requirements process, making sure that it's validated. There's an assessment that is testing all of those requirements that we've built out, and then ultimately feeding that back into our work with those international organizations and standards bodies. And so how we see this is really through a third-party review process. So having the community work and build that, and then it being accredited by Standards Council of Canada in the Canadian context and other accreditation bodies globally. And then those third-party auditors actually doing that review and then ultimately providing the certification. And from this, it really, as I was mentioning before, we're not building out all of these standards on our own. We are really working with the broader community to build from this existing research and body of work. And within that, as I was mentioning, the scope of what we're looking at are those systems, so the data algorithms, and then the context or the processes. And then wanting to make sure that we're really thinking about this in relationship to the companies that are building those systems. We do care a lot about the end users, but that's not our area of expertise. And so with that, we partner with organizations like Consumer Reports that can really give us a much better understanding of how consumers need to have consent that's provided to them, have explainability in terms of how that system operates, to what extent, etc. And so within this, we really see ourselves as just part of the responsible AI ecosystem, and that includes the research, as I've mentioned, also training and education. I didn't talk about too much, but that's a very, very important aspect of this, and hopefully is being built into curriculum like information management courses, and that connection back to broader standards and governance that we're seeing. I've cited some of these resources, but now just happy to take any questions. And if you have questions beyond our question and answer period right now, you can always connect with us through any of these channels. Thanks, Vivian, back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ashley. That was a really interesting overview. So many really important and fascinating issues about ethical uses of AI. So let's address some of your questions, and please, if you have questions, feel free to add them to the chat now. But we'll start with a question that has already been added to the chat, and that is, recognizing that most of the people in your audience are information professionals or information professionals to be, people doing their graduate degree in information management. How can information professionals, as stewards of data and data literacy, practice and promote responsible AI? Kind of what is, or what would you see as the responsibility of people in the information management field?
I think that's a great question. Something that's quite important, I think, is to understand that information is really what's fueling all of these systems, and really understanding that I refer to it in here as data. We can get into a discussion about the difference between data and information, but for purposes of what I was talking about in my presentation, really talking about it in terms of data being an important and valuable input. I think understanding the implications of that within these systems is quite important. So both, as I was saying near the end, building this into a curriculum that there's an awareness of those implications and why information management practices are so vital. Both the collection, the accuracy, the management overall is essential to the functioning of these technologies. So I think that all of this needs to be integrated and hopefully propagated through various different courses within an information management program.
Yeah, and it's an interesting topic, because I really see your presentation and a lot of what you were discussing this evening being at that intersection between policy and kind of information management, and also, you know, computer science, you know, sort of the sort of harder side of the field. I'd be interested, maybe you could just talk a little bit about how your route into this sort of intersection of issues. Did you come into this field or into this area from the policy side or the tech side?
Yeah, that was
how
a
you
great question. Mainly from the policy side. So my background's in political science, and then I ended up coming to the Government of Canada via the City of Edmonton, where I was working on the Open Data Portal and Open Data initiatives. And so within that, I was asked to build Canada's Open Government Portal, and through that needed to take then enterprise architecture courses and really understand the implications of technology. And so this idea of business and technology, like I was talking about, working together is a big component of that. And so in this, I became really interested in the underlying policies that help to support those objectives or the proper functioning of those systems. And so I really feel that what I'm doing today is super similar to the objectives that we had in an open government context of being transparent, making sure that there's good access to services and information to the public. And so a lot of those same principles transcend. So that's how I got into this.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And I do know that a number of the students in our program come into our program from backgrounds in political science as well, and have a particular interest in this area. I'll just put in a little plug for a course that we're offering this summer on government information, and you know, certainly we'll be addressing this whole topic of open government, which I think is so important. Another question or another you know, sort of interesting observation was the one you made about that inverse relationship between the importance of the AI system and the level of mistrust that people have in that system, which is, you know, really quite sobering and you know, kind of worrisome in terms of people's overall attitude towards AI. I wondered if you had any sort of further breakdown of the demographics in that observation. Like, are there differences by age group or by region or?
Yeah, actually that survey was super interesting because it did articulate that there was a big distinction between men and women, and at that time that was the only two genders that they were that they had observed. But what was really interesting was that I can't remember the exact breakdown, but it was women of a particular age group and then men of a particular age group that had the least degree of trust. And I believe it was older men and like middle-aged women. And so it was quite interesting. And that was actually, I mentioned that there was some similar research that had been done through this public sector working group that I'm part of Canada's AI Working Council. And again, I think the methodology does not make it comparable, but one of the interesting things to me in that was that there was a shift in trust between those demographics. And so I think that I don't know why the pandemic put a bit of a kink into our plans to do a lot of public consultation around this, but it is something interesting to research who's not trusting based on that. So
no, it's very interesting. And going back to some of the questions in the chat, what do you believe is the greatest threat to AI in the future? And alternatively, the greatest misconception from laypersons, kind of getting back to that that level of mistrust.
The greatest threat to AI or AI to people? I think
the question is the greatest misconception or the greatest threat to AI.
Okay. I think that if we're thinking about it then from an adoption perspective, would be then that people are not trusting of it, and then there's a lot of movements that I'm sure all of you are more than familiar with to stop using facial recognition systems, to ban the use of automated hiring systems, those types of things. And so I do think that perceptions in terms of how they're being used, there's been a lot of really good research in terms of how facial recognition systems for ease of transit, for example, in the European Union, to just quickly identify people or in crowds is quite useful. My favorite example is how facial recognition systems can help people that are trying to find human traffickers. And so to say just to ban systems, I think is really problematic. And that I think can lead to a lot of the mistrust and misperceptions that do exist about what their potential possibilities are. But I do think that a lack of regulations is leading to that then, because we're not then able to have a nuanced dialogue about it, and we're really reliant then on media and companies both pushing their own different views and objectives.
Very interesting. And I know most of what you were talking about this evening was talking about the Canadian context, which of course is super relevant and very important for us to know about. Are there any countries that you would identify as being leaders in responsible AI, or flipping it around, that are particularly egregious in being behind in responsible AI?
I think that there's a really great map on OECD's Public Policy Observatory website that I would encourage everybody to check out, and then you can make your own analysis of what's good and not good. I think that's part of the challenge, is that based on the different values that one holds, there are egregious acts and then really responsible acts. I think that I would just make the comment about Canada. I think that we were doing a lot. I think leading the Global Partnership on AI is excellent, but I do think that following through with those regulations, really understanding how to expand Bill C-11 to include a lot of this work is something that's needed, and I don't think that we're doing as well as other countries in this regard. So I do think that it's a bit of a more nuanced. I don't think there's just countries that are overall, and even I think a very typical response would have been China's doing terrible and every other country is doing great, but it's not true. Like, there's a lot of serious, from our perspective, social challenges that exist with the use of AI systems in countries like China and others that have a different social value system, and we can probably agree that that's not how we would want to have it used in our society. However, it's a different social contract, if you will. So being respectful and understanding of that is quite important. And then also then that allows us to understand where to draw a line. And so using it to repress a certain demographic or community is a very different thing than having social points, which again, I don't like either of these options, me personally. However, one, there's a a big community that does really like that. The other one, I think we can all agree, is awful.
Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting. And the next question kind of touches at some of these same issues, but looking more from the corporate or the company side. The question is, as you mentioned, many companies that use AI now or in the future are multinational. They operate across national borders. So could you speak a little bit about how regulations, if they're national regulations, can be applied to such companies?
This is a big problem that we're all seeing with how regulations of social media are playing out. I don't have a silver bullet for this, but I do think that having the reason why a lot of this discussion is being had at international organizations is the recognition that these systems are produced in one place and transcend those physical borders, and also that there's different values that function. And so there's still very regional-based applications, which have a particular audience and therefore market adoption. So that kind of dictates how they're used. But I do think that having as much consistency as possible in international laws, but also then that transcending into public laws, or sorry, public governance within both federal and state provincial governments is quite important. And so that we don't have the discrepancies like we see with Ireland related to general privacy protections, for example, and the rest of a similar world. So I think that that's quite important. And one step forward on that recently was OECD, sorry, not OECD, UNESCO, and the principles work that they've done has 97 recommendations on how member nations should be adopting AI in a responsible way. And it is based on the OECD principles, which is why I mentioned that. And so those recommendations, though, there's a report now that 192 countries as of last Wednesday signed on to this, and they will now have to report every 4 years on their progress related to that. So hopefully those types of activities, even though at a fairly high level, might be able to at least provide some of that commonality and consistency.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. Thank you for that. It is a very complicated situation when you do have these huge companies that, you know, are operating simultaneously in so many different jurisdictions. So,
yeah.
Stepping back a little bit to think a bit more about sort of the preparation, not just for information professionals, but for any university student as a responsible citizen. This question is, what type of training or education should we be ensuring all university students graduate with so they're prepared to work in a world where it looks like we'll be adopting more AI, not less?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think similar to, as I was mentioning, not geared specifically to information management or data management, but I do think that including and incorporating it into curriculum to just understand how AI is being used. And that's why I like this story. Maybe it's boring to people, of just mines and HVAC systems. Like, it's not something I think about ever. And to see these articles come up or studies come up about the use of them, you see both the opportunity, but it makes you question how many of the other services that I'm using or things that I'm reliant on in my life are potentially using AI systems. And I know we see this kind of branding around smart technologies, and like, I don't need a smart stove. I don't want it to monitor what I do, but maybe some people, also don't have a family. And so maybe having the oven turned on when you're coming home from a hockey practice is really, really helpful. And so I do see the potential benefit of it. But again, really being understanding of what type of then privacy you're giving up, because there's a connection into your Wi-Fi system within your house and what type of data it's collecting. All of these things are things that, independent of what you're studying within school. I think that it's important to understand the implications, and then if you have agency within your work to try and mitigate any of those potential harms, or try and build in these requirements as we're proposing into how they're being designed and built. I think that's quite important. And there's one professor that I do quite a bit of work with. He's an ethics professor, and he's said to me, he's like, I've taught ethics for 25 years, but I'm not teaching people how to be ethical. And so it's this, and that really has stuck with me, because those are examples of, again, like just how pervasive this is. How do you, no matter where you end up and whatever your training is, how do you apply that lens of these mitigation practices and measures into your work?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, and it's particularly interesting for us right now at Dalhousie, because we have a new digital strategy, and so one of the issues that we're grappling with is exactly this: like, what are the digital skills that any student should have upon graduation to really be able to be an effective citizen in an increasingly digital world? So, and AI is certainly one piece of that. Got a question that kind of is flipping more to the positive side, and this question asks about your thoughts on how we measure positive impacts of AI. We've talked a lot about people's mistrust and fear and anxiety and so on. How do governments measure the positive impact of AI, and in specifically talking about Canada, how is the Canadian government measuring that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's really important to focus on both the opportunities for increased adoption so that it can help improve better services. It can ensure that safety and protection through things like train derailments. It can provide better access and benefits. There's a massive backlog of not only benefits, and we saw with COVID that then there was a lot of opportunity or potential for fraud in the benefit system because they didn't have the appropriate mechanisms in place for oversight. So I think it is very important to focus on what those opportunities are. How those are being tracked is a little bit more difficult, because if something doesn't go wrong, you don't know what that delta was potentially, and so can just be a comparison to metrics like efficiency and effectiveness, greater access to Canadians in that way, or through those mechanisms, from a past example to current use, and then no train derailments is a really good one. So things like that, and I didn't get into the example, but that was exactly why there was the example, or I had the example of the suicide prevention and the work that was being done to really understand not just what root causes are of using a lot of data and data analysis to understand what root causes of suicide are, but then use that in a call center to try and help the agents predict how to interact with people to really save them. And so there was a lot of great analysis done on that system being used versus it not being in use.
No, it's very interesting. Thank you. And here's a question that might be a little bit more provocative or a bit more controversial, but it's asking, in your opinion, do leaders in the public sector, from deputy ministers on down, have the necessary skills and knowledge to provide adequate oversight to AI efforts in their organizations? I mean, have they had the training that we were just talking about a few minutes ago to enable them to have that level of oversight?
I mean, I don't think we can paint any sort of demographic group with a broad brush. And I would say the same is true for digital literacy within the public sector. What I would say, though, is that of all the executives that I came across that were really thinking about the implications of AI, were quite thoughtful and quite intentional about not only understanding the potential harms that could occur, but really recognizing the need to take some action and to do something about it. I I think, though, that there is often, as these things happen, a disconnect between recognizing that there's an issue and providing appropriate support and funding for that. And so that's something that I see not just in the Canadian government, in the US federal government. We do a lot of work with them, and other governments. Just there's a lot of AI committees and councils and things being set up, but the action to follow these requirements through is not there yet.
Mm. Thank you for that. Thank you for your thoughts on that. And as you can see, you've generated a lot of really great questions. We knew this topic would be provocative and would generate these questions, but I think we have time for one more. And this question is talking about something you alluded to, the discussion of transparency and trust, and the potential for citizen oversight and engagement in AI processes. Can you share any insights into what such mechanisms might look like, and what should they be most looking for?
Great. Really happy that somebody picked up on that. So I think about this a lot in terms of an individual who is almost like a patient health advocate, and kind of an analogy to that. And I don't know that it's perfect. I get pulled in so many different directions that I don't get to do enough research ever on any of these things, but that's at the top of my list for 2022, because I do think that it's important to have these different perspectives, like I was saying, within the organization. But if you're not really bringing in somebody that is representative, at least, of the population that's being impacted, or populations that are being impacted, then you're missing a really important perspective. And but there's pros and cons to that. It's not, there's lots of client satisfaction surveys and things like that are done in industry, but it's doing public consultation like we do in government is not that typical. And if they record something and then they don't do it, then that's opening up liability and risk. And so how to make it possible, I think, is kind of to what I was just saying. There's a big difference between identifying that it's a problem and really figuring out how to make that possible. But I do, the closest I've come is thinking about it in terms of, because there also becomes an issue related to how do you get feedback from the entire demographic? It's impossible. And maybe there's a bunch of issues related to intersectional demographics. And so I think the best thing is this, anyway, at least where I'm at right now, maybe I'll change in a little bit, but is something akin to like a mental health patient advocate, where you have somebody that's either representative of that population, or they had the same lived experiences, or they really understand the issues, and then can provide just a perspective that is maybe something that is quite obvious within a certain population, but very, very different than the people that are kind of hands on keyboard or providing the requirements.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Ashley. This has been an absolutely fascinating presentation, great discussion. You've been awesome answering this sort of raft of questions that people had for you. So thank you so much for taking the time to respond to our questions. I think we'll wrap things up. We've got just a couple of minutes before our time is officially up. So thank you so much, Ashley, for this fascinating and really provocative presentation. And thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. I hope you have a really good evening. Look out for the announcement of our next public lecture. It will be the Dalhousie Horrocks National Leadership Lecture and Award presentation. And I'm really excited to announce that this year our speaker will be Dr. Carla Hayden, who is the first woman and the first African American to lead the Library of Congress. So that will be a great session. It's scheduled for early in the new year, hopefully sometime in January, so just watch for further announcements. And I'd also just like to close by saying that this, in fact, is the final event of my year as acting director of SIM. And I'd like to extend a special thank you to everyone for attending, to all the members of SIM for all their great support. And I wish you all the very best for the holidays. Thank you so much. Bye now.